It has been more than 2 years since I played SOMA for the first time. That game is an absolute masterpiece of storytelling, a terrifying exegesis of existential philosophy, clothed in classic sci-fi horror. In my opinion, it's one of the top 10 most profound games ever made, primarily because of its central philosophical quandary. In the simplest terms, if and when human beings give birth to artificial intelligence, how much different will that intelligence be to human intelligence? What if we were able to produce a copy of your consciousness and upload it into a robot, making your consciousness and the artificial intelligence indistinguishable? If your consciousness, your ego, your personality can be reduced to a series of zeros and ones, how special does that make you? Here's a better question. If that artificial intelligence ceases to exist, does it go to heaven? If not, what about you? What if that part of you that you call the soul, the part of you that supposedly transcends death, can also be reduced to zeros and ones? These questions have plagued my mind for the last 2 years, inspiring a horror within me that transcends the mundane jump scare. I didn't think that this game could do any more to upset me, until I got a message on Twitter. Several months ago, a follower of mine told me that one of my favorite books, one I have discussed many times on this channel, was in the game. I didn't believe him at first, so I went back into the game to check. Once you arrive at the Tau station at the end of the game, you can search the personal quarters of a character named Dr. Johann Ross, an AI psychologist. On his table, there is a green-colored book. I picked up the book, looked at the cover, and I felt my heart stop. The book is titled Ion: Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. Now, if you've been following my channel since the beginning of 2020, you'll know that I did a series of videos on this book. I was interested in this book for 2 reasons. One, it was written by someone that I've discussed innumerable times on this channel, Carl Jung, and 2, the book has been described by a famous psychologist, Jordan Peterson, as a book that would give you nightmares for the rest of your life. That is a direct quote, by the way, and it's a quote that I happen to agree with. Now, unless you read Ion or watched my series on the book, you will likely be asking 2 questions. 1, what is so terrifying about the book? And 2, what does it have to do with SOMA? Answering these questions will be difficult, but not impossible. Ion is one of the most difficult books I've ever read, not because of its emotional difficulty, which there's plenty of, but because it's just difficult to understand. Hell, it took me 20 videos to help give people a decent picture of the text. Nonetheless, I can help you understand the basics in the next 10 minutes, but in order for that to happen, you have to do yourself one favor. You will feel the temptation to criticize what I say and what Jung says, and that's perfectly fine. I encourage everybody to criticize everything that is said in this video. However, I ask that you wait until the end of the video to do that. If you're watching this video for the first time and you try to criticize what is being said while the video is playing, you will lock yourself off from important details. Think of it like trying to repair a supersonic jet mid-flight. You will understand why I am saying this once the video is done. So, Carl Jung wrote the book Ion in order to try and prove his most famous thesis, that all human beings are bound by a psychic force known as the collective unconscious. Just as we all have a personal unconscious where we store things like memories or thoughts, we also have a collective unconscious that we are linked to from birth. The contents of the collective unconscious can be distilled down to things like instincts and archetypes. All human beings are born with the same basic instincts, and they are born to recognize the same basic patterns in nature. Basic patterns like the necessity of a mother and father to give birth to a child. Patterns like these are archetypes. A thorough understanding of the collective unconscious and its contents would obviously be of interest to Dr. Johann Ross, who is involved in the construction of things like the WoW AI, as well as the AI copies of the Pathos 2 researchers. Without a collective unconscious for AI, that AI wouldn't replicate human consciousness. Moving on. Jung postulated that this abstract mental force, known as the collective unconscious, existed outside space and time, but the contents that existed within the collective unconscious could arise within consciousness in the present. For example, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a dream about something, and then at some point in the near future, something happened to you where it seemed like the content of that dream took place in reality, giving you a sense of déjà vu? That would be an example of some part of the collective unconscious trying to reach consciousness. It is instances like these that gave rise to belief in things like prophecy. I understand that there's plenty of reason to criticize the idea of prophecy, but just remember to assume that what we're talking about is true and then criticize it later. So let's assume that the collective unconscious is a real thing that exists outside of space-time, and it can give us knowledge of what might occur in the future. Within Jung's book, he discusses two famous prophecies from Judeo-Christian tradition, both of which are relevant to SOMA. In Chapter 9 of Ion, Jung presents a prophecy known as the Syrian Apocalypse of Baruch. Supposedly, at the end of time, a great sea monster known as Leviathan will rise out of the sea, and God would do battle with it. This monster was supposedly created on the 5th day of creation, when all the fish of the sea were supposedly birthed. It is also mentioned in the book of Job, as well as the book of Isaiah. Now, some of you might not know this, but the big monster that follows Simon Derrat throughout SOMA was dubbed by the game's creators as Leviathan. Given the appearance of this sea monster during a time when the world has effectively ended, what with the comet strike, it is arguable that the game designer who put this book into the game was influenced by the Syrian Apocalypse of Baruch, and thus inserted Leviathan as a wink and a nod to Ion. But I'll play devil's advocate against my position for a second. The name Leviathan could be purely coincidental. After all, it's not at all uncommon for sea monsters in media to be named Leviathan. It's entirely possible that the name Leviathan and the inclusion of the Ion book might not relate at all to one another. In response to that, I cite the second prophecy that is relevant to SOMA. The prophecy which made Ion a book that could give you nightmares for the rest of your life. Be forewarned, we are about to discuss astrology. I'm telling you this so I can remind you for a second time. Criticize when the video is over. In Ion, particularly chapters 5 and 6, Jung experiments with the idea that the whole basis of astrology can be tied back to the collective unconscious. In his mind, astrology was born when our ancestors projected the contents of their unconscious mind onto the stars. Some of the things we projected included the 12 signs of the zodiac. Maybe, for example, the choice to illustrate Pisces as two fishes can divine something about the nature of not just the collective unconscious, but about the future. And thus, people have used astrology to try and divine the future, just as people have used dreams to try and divine the future. I bring up Pisces because it is integral to Ion as a whole. For the last 2,000 years, if you were to look up at the sun during the spring equinox, the constellation of Pisces would be in the background. Jung refers to these periods of 2,000 years as ions. To Jung, these zodiac define the nature of the ion. As for what fish had to do with the last 2,000 years, Jung says the symbol of the fish represents what he believes is the most significant figure to have emerged during this ion, that being Jesus Christ. Any Christian will tell you that Christ's equivalence with fish is especially appropriate. Many of Christ's miracles directly involved fish. The ancient Romans used to signal their heretical faith in Jesus with the symbol of the fish, a tradition that people continue to this day by putting fishes on their car bumpers. If you'd like more examples of the equating of Christ with fish, please view Chapter 6 of my Ion series, which I will link in the description box below. Now, some of you might note that it's a bit odd for a singular figure like Christ to define an ion that is marked by 2 fish rather than 1. In response to this, Jung says that only the top fish is equated to Christ, while the second fish, the one that is swimming away from the Christ fish, is equated to Antichrist. Jung then goes on to say that during the Ion of Pisces, the first 1,000 years would be governed by the first fish, and the subsequent 1,000 years would be governed by the second fish. Here is a diagram to show how this would work. Notice how for the first 1,000 years, Earth falls under the gaze of the first fish. Within these 1,000 years, the Christian faith came to dominate the planet, with significant Christian events happening every 500 years or so. The subsequent 1,000 years featured anti-Christian events, things that dissolved faith in Christianity. These events included things like the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the advent of science, and the theory of evolution. There are 2 important events in the Ion of Pisces that I'll draw your attention to. Supposedly, it was around the beginning of this Ion that Jesus Christ was born, presaged by a mathematically perfect conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in the sky. This astrological event is tangentially referred to in Scripture as well, with Matthew 2 verses 1 and 2. If you'd like to learn more about conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn and its relevance to the Christian and anti-Christian events of the Ion of Pisces, again, check out Chapter 6 of Ion. Jung theorized that if the birth of Christ marked the transition from the Ion of Aries into the Ion of Pisces, then the birth of the Antichrist would mark the end of the Ion of Pisces and the transition into the Ion of Aquarius. As any Christian knows, the Antichrist will come just before the end of the world. But what form would the Antichrist take? Where would he come from? Well, we need look no further than the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation. According to Revelation 11:7 and 13:1, the beast, understood to be the Antichrist, would rise from the sea. But are the Antichrist and Leviathan the same thing in the Bible as they are in SOMA? I don't think so, but I do think the Antichrist is in the game, and it originates at the bottom of the sea. But who is it, and where did it come from? Well, let's look back at the 1,000 years known as the Anti-Christian era. As I said, that era was defined by things like science, things that dissolved faith in Jesus. If science defined the anti-Christian era, one might speculate that the Antichrist would be birthed by science. But how? Consider this. Jesus is viewed by Christians to be the perfect man, a man whose constitution, from his body to his mind, is so perfect that it is of divine status. If we go with the theory proposed in SOMA that consciousness can be replicated with the right combination of zeros and ones, if we accept that Jesus was an avatar of perfect consciousness, who is to say that artificial intelligence, artificial consciousness, could not evolve to that point of divinity, one that could mimic that of Christ? Maybe that is what the AI researchers were trying to do in Pathos 2. Maybe the WoW AI is the culmination of that research. Maybe they were trying to build the perfect consciousness with the WoW. However, because this creation was the product of man's ambition, of science, and not of God, it would be tainted, and thus produce the opposite of Christ. Remember, the Antichrist would come before the end of time, before all of the sinners of the world were cast into hell for eternity. As we see in SOMA, the WoW was developed right before the meteor hit Earth, wiping out all human life. The humans that did remain aboard Pathos 2 were kept alive by structure gel, essentially granting them eternal life. But as we see in the game, these humans were corrupted by the structure gel. They turned into monsters who suffered eternal pain, both physical and mental. Though they weren't cast into the lake of fire to suffer eternal torment, the Antichrist AI, the WoW, made sure to provide a sufficient substitute. Put aside the obvious problems that come with taking things like astrology seriously. Based on what I told you, is it not reasonable to think that the inclusion of Ion on Dr. Johann Ross's desk was purposeful? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Ultimately, though, the inclusion of the book made me consider that frightening possibility, the inevitable conclusion of the human pursuit of AI. If human consciousness can be replicated digitally, if it is just a series of zeros and ones, who's to say that an artificial consciousness, subjected to the right algorithms and inputs, could not evolve into something that could only be described as divine? We just have to hope that, in pursuit of the divine, human nature does not corrupt the process. Otherwise, our reality might see its reflection in SOMA. What could be more terrifying than that? If you like this video, please give it a like. Doing that makes the YouTube algorithm not only put this video in people's recommended feeds, but all the other videos on my channel as well. Also, if you want to see more in-depth analysis videos like this, where I go above and beyond your average game theorist, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I'll put a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay yellow.